My name is Lindsay Draper. We are thrilled to get the chance to hear what you have to say. I want to start off by congratulating you. We're going to tell you a bit about ourselves, and then we'd like you to introduce yourselves and your teacher. As I told you, I'm Lindsay Draper. I am from Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, retired from the juvenile court bench here. My colleagues are.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan Taubman. I'm a senior judge on the Colorado Court of Appeals in Denver, Colorado.
Hey, y'all. My name is Thomas Mackey. I'm in the history department at the University of Louisville, as well as with the law school here at the U of L.
And you are.
Good afternoon. We are Foothill High School's Unit 2, representing the state of California and the city of Pleasanton. My name is Ananya Kutikad.
My name is Sanjana Dukapati.
My name is Charlotte Zander.
And my name is Ted Kim. We would like to thank the judges, the audience, and the timekeeper for being here today, as well as each of our coaches, Mr. McBride, Mr. Dattamore, and Mr. Constantelos.
Okay. Well, we're going to be doing the first of the Unit 2 questions today. What were the major disagreements among the 55 delegates during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and how were they resolved? What issues, if any, were not resolved, and what were the consequences? What changes, if any, should be made to the Constitution? Begin.
If the Constitution were a rocket, then the framers were the engineers, assembling their views to produce a document capable of taking the nation to the moon. This task did not come without arguments between the nation's engineers themselves. Delegates disagreed on several issues, but the most intense arguments revolved around representation in Congress and the proposed constitutional negative.
As James Madison mused, the convention's great difficulty lies in representation. Hugh Williamson of North Carolina accused small states of attempting to take over the federal government through equal representation. Small states fiercely fought back. Gunning Bedford Jr. of Delaware even warned the convention that small states will find some foreign ally who will take them by the hand and do them justice. With the fledgling nation at risk of dissolving, large states begrudgingly agreed to the Connecticut Compromise, creating a proportional House of Representatives and an equal Senate.
Another disagreement was over the original Virginia plan's constitutional negative, which would have allowed Congress to veto state laws. James Madison believed this provision would protect the national government from the states and the states from each other. However, delegates such as Elbridge Gerry claimed the veto would enslave the states to the national government. While the constitutional negative did not survive in its original form, the sentiment prevailed through the Supremacy Clause in Article 6.
Although the framers' rocket had a successful takeoff, its engineers failed to resolve the key issues of slavery and voting, veering the nation off course. While some delegates, like Gouverneur Morris, condemned slavery, the convention chose to appease the South through the Three-Fifths Compromise. The convention's approach to this issue set a precedent of compromising over slavery at the national level, dooming America to regional conflict and ultimately the Civil War.
The lack of true resolution to slavery was expected, given the South's vehement pro-slavery position at the convention. South Carolina Governor Rollins Lowndes even stated in 1788 that without slaves, this state would degenerate into the most contemptible in the Union. Governor Lowndes sent 4 wealthy plantation owners to Philadelphia, who would ardently defend the institution to support their lavish livelihoods.
While slavery remained unresolved despite its prominence at the convention, the delegates simply did not consider voting qualification in great detail. Though the framers discussed the merits of property requirements for voting, the convention decided to delegate the House's voting qualifications to the states in Article 1, Section 2, leaving the unamended Constitution utterly without protections for voting. Ultimately, these unfinished debates surrounding slavery and voting left the country without a national standard of citizenship until Reconstruction.
Today, our constitutional rocket is facing a crisis. It has given an increasingly small minority a death grip over our political system, as seen in our broken Senate and amendment process, both tied excessively to the states. Equal representation in the Senate contradicts our Republican framework of government, as over half the population lives in just 9 states, according to census data from 2018. We feel the best solution to this is Professor Eric Ortz's plan for a proportional Senate, which would preserve at least 1 senator per state while reapportioning the remaining 50 seats.
Still, change is unlikely unless we fix our amendment process. Article 5 grants an extremely small minority the power to block even the most beneficial amendments. Patrick Henry pointed this out at the Virginia Ratification Convention in 1788, claiming that 5% of the national population could block an amendment. Today, that number is closer to 2%. One way to address this is by creating an alternative ratification path that bypasses the states by ratifying amendments through a 2/3 national popular vote. This would place ratification in the hands of the people, shifting power away from the states. On the other hand, we believe the congressional proposal process for amendments should be retained in combination with the ORTS Senate plan.
The convention did not necessarily produce effective constitutional provisions. The smallest of founding era miscalculations may be causing irreversible damage to our rocket, and we must adapt our national document to address them. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just pose a question to you based on your thought about the 2/3 popular vote being the way to make the changes. What if I were to suggest to you that that essentially says it again will become an issue of money, because whoever has the most amount of money can buy enough ads, can persuade enough people to decide any vote? Because let's be honest, that determines a lot of who gets elected, who has the most money. What would you say to me?
Well, I would say firstly that that's one of the reasons why we don't choose a simple majority in terms of approving such amendments, because when in regards to picking the 2/3 majority, when we look at national votes in the past, we see that they don't happen as often very recently, especially because one of the last kind of 2/3 votes for president was back when James Monroe was elected for the popular vote. And so I would say that while that is a concern and that money, of course, does influence situations where there is democracy, we believe that the 2/3 threshold is enough of a check in the modern day.
I would also say that by retaining the congressional proposal process, that is in Article 5 of the Constitution, is another way to prevent this, because the only amendments that can be proposed are ones that can get through Congress. And so because of this, we can see that the people aren't necessarily, they're not proposing and ratifying the amendments, they are just ratifying them. And so we would hope that the amendments that get through Congress are ones that are not with moneyed interests.
Well, let me jump in. I'm always happy to talk about the federal convention and those issues. Representation certainly has front seat, but right behind it with the concerns of the delegates was the role of the presidency and the president. And certainly the Anti-Federalists had, the institution gave the Anti-Federalists the willies. And by the early 21st century, we live, as some scholars call, in government by president, even a cult of the presidency. How did the delegates think about the role of the president? How did they deal with this issue of the executive? And then how has it worked out over time?
Okay, to address the first part about what they thought specifically during the convention, I would say that the delegates were very much, while they were skeptical over a large executive figure, they did understand the necessity of it when it came to what the state of the nation was in at that time, especially after Shays' Rebellion, where a strong executive, the lack of a strong executive was really strong. And so I'd say that at that time, they kind of knew that George Washington would be this figurehead and would be the president. And therefore, they left Article 2 specifically vague and kind of wanted to go off the precedent that President Washington would later set on, which is why, while they were skeptical over the presidential power being too strong, they understood that having a figurehead that helped the country so much during the war would be beneficial, because he would be able to set a strong precedent for the future.
And specifically, one of the powers that was of the president that was mentioned at the at the Philadelphia Convention was the concept of the executive pardon. And delegates like George Mason strongly advocated for a wide-ranging executive pardon, even in cases of treason. And the Anti-Federalists were quick to point this out at the ensuing ratification debate. For example, Cato 4 points out that because given that the president can issue pardons for treason, he and his sort of cabal can sort of continue to commit treason, and then the president will be able to endlessly be able to pardon them. So therefore, the president will basically just be acting as a tyrant, as Cato claimed.
And as for how it's kind of worked out today, I'd say one of the reasons why we've seen an expansion of the office is actually Gouverneur Morris's work. He worked on the Committee of Style, and he was the one who specifically added the herein granted phrase to the Article 1 vesting clause, but not the Article 2 vesting clause, in order to make sure that presidential power was able to kind of be more vague and not necessarily enumerated. And I think that's what's kind of created this system where presidential power in itself kind of fluctuates based on kind of the actions of Congress, whether Congress is in concurrence with the president or not. And so I'd say that that's why we see, in terms of executive power and how much they exert today, there is the sense that it's much more vague, but also can be kind of amplified if there is united government.
I'd like to turn to the question of voting, which you mentioned as one that was basically left to the states in Article 1, Section 2. How has our country dealt with the issue of voting since the ratification of the Constitution? And is that still an unresolved issue?
I think one place we've seen that voting has become the issue that the fact that the states have been charged with managing voting has been an issue. Immediately in the aftermath of the Civil War, we see that many southern states led by redeemers, Southern Democrats trying to sort of disenfranchise, bring back the African-American population to slavery, we're implementing things such as literacy tests and grandfather clauses in order to limit the newly freed African-American population and forbid them from exercising their own power to sort of influence policy within the government. So even though this was just 100 years after the convention, this still had this power left the state, still had huge implications for this population.
Additionally, until the 1920s, we saw that women didn't have a say in government and couldn't vote. And this was one issue that was obviously unresolved for a very long time, up until the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And that is something that was definitely detrimental to progression of voting in this country.
And in terms of today, I would say that voting is still an issue and still an unresolved issue. As we see in the wake of this past election, states such as Georgia are implementing strict voter ID laws to prevent certain individuals from voting. And there still isn't a national positive right to vote in our Constitution, which means that not everyone still has an equal opportunity to vote. So I would say that voting is still an issue in this country. And the fact that they didn't discuss this at the Constitution and didn't put that in our Constitution is a problem, and we can still see that today.
So if I were to take the position that the Senate is just fine, that I believe, because I'm from one of the flyover states, I'm in Wisconsin, and we have 2 senators, but unlike some other people in this country, one is a Republican, one's a Democrat. One represents what would be considered liberal or progressive parts of the world, and one represents relatively conservative. My view is we, what you may think of as small state, have a Senate representation that represents America. What I'm hearing is an effort to take that away. How would you respond to that?
Well, coming from a larger state like California, there are so many diverse interests in this state that come with being obviously very populous and having 2 very large cities in the state. And therefore, as a state that has the same amount of senators as a state like Wisconsin has, we feel underrepresented, or it is very possible for states such as California to feel underrepresented in Senate, and oftentimes even steamrolled by the smaller states in terms of these more minor groups getting their voices heard. That's why I personally don't agree that everything is all right in the Senate, because such diverse groups that live in larger states are completely not represented in the Senate.
And I would also say, I would also say that if we continue with the California example and we're talking about representation in division of political parties, I would point to the fact that recently we tried to create a three-state solution where the upper half of California, which leans more conservative, would be able to have their own senators. And I think that kind of points to the fact that California itself, even with these larger states, by having two senators, you're actually limiting the other perspectives of people who are more conservative or in the Republican areas of those states. And so actually proportionalizing it would, I think, be actually more representative of America than the current system, although that might be the case in Wisconsin.
And I would add,
Oh,
I would add that our problem with equal representation stems not just from what's happening today, but what happened at the convention. The small states were able to make this into a political issue and basically just wanted more power. But we've seen that small states, the size of the state has always been a red herring. It's never really been a problem. The larger states were never going to unite against the small states because they were regionally different. The Civil War was a regional problem between the North and the South. Today, we see the two largest states, California and Texas, are politically on opposite sides of the spectrum. So if we had a proportional system today, it would, may I finish my thought?
Yes.
It would mean that they were not united against the small states because they are on opposite sides of the spectrum.
Thank you. Well, since I sort of have the mic right now, I'll go ahead and do my critique. I enjoyed your presentation. And one of the things that I think is really important, if you were not prepared to defend your ideas, then you ought not be saying them. And so I really liked when you pushed back with the proposal that I made, or the comments that I made about not really being sure that I think the Senate is broken. You did a good job of starting out, and frankly, not starting out by saying, well, first there was there were the articles, and then there was the Virginia plan, and then you did a good job of building to it and talking about how there were things that happened that arose out of these plans. I appreciated that. You were very specific in what you were making as suggestions for the amendments, and you basically answered the questions they asked, and I appreciated your presentation. Good luck to you, and thank you very much.
Yeah, I thought this went well. I thought you handled tough questions well. My question about the executive is who's driving the rocket? And to pick up on your image, and should we really trust him or her? And I hope the answer is maybe, but probably not. And so you want to think about that. And as a member of the panel in even a smaller state, crushing California sounds just fine to me, or breaking it up in 3 different ways. So, and I'm just being facetious, don't misunderstand. Don't sue, but you get the idea here. So I thought you did a good job of covering the waterfront, taking a position and defending it. Well done.
Following up on your rocket analogy, I would say that I had a blast listening to you. I thought that you did a good job talking about the issues of representation and what you described as the congressional negative of the veto of state laws, which I don't think we've heard from any other team so far. Interestingly, as I was listening to your comments and the questions of some of the judges about your proposal for proportional representation for the Senate, it sounded very much to me like the founding fathers debates over the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. And oh my God, California is not getting the representation it deserves. So, but you know, that just shows that it's an issue of continuing interest, even over 200 years after the ratification of the Constitution. I did very much like your response to the question about the executive power and saying that Article 2 was left vague because the founders knew that George Washington was going to be president. And I think that's a good observation. They all knew that, or they expected that he would be president, and everybody trusted George Washington. So that would be a good explanation as to why they didn't make the powers for the president more specific. When the last comment I have is that when you talked about, when I asked you about voting, whether that's still unrealized in terms of something that the founders gave very little attention to. I would have liked to have heard a little bit more about some of the constitutional amendments. You did mention the 19th Amendment, but there have been a number of other amendments, including the one that gave the right to 18-year-olds and one prohibiting the poll tax that you might have mentioned. But overall, I think you did a really nice job, and you showed that you have a really good understanding of all aspects of the question. So congratulations on your presentation today.
Yeah. Nicely done, folks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Good
much.
deal. Good deal.
All